Members are directed to uphold and maintain decorum in the House. Mr. President, you continue.
Thank you.
Hey friends, Hannah is here. Let's talk real stuff. So what is just happening right now? Trump's congressional address became the most humiliating in modern history. A half-empty chamber, senators walking out mid-speech, a congressman escorted out by security, members holding liar and king signs, and over a dozen lawmakers boycotting entirely to protest outside.
I walked out of the State of the Union address early because I'd heard enough. What we saw from the president was nothing but rambling lies. Americans know the truth. Trump is wrecking our economy, spending tens of billions on an out-of-control secret police, and lining his own pockets. But here's what's most concerning to me. My Republican colleagues cheered on Trump with every lie he told. It's clear. Republicans in Congress won't stand up to the president's actions that are raising costs and making our country less safe.
Senator Mark Warner walked out on camera and told reporters he could not sit through hours of the president's lies, accusing him of jacking up costs and wrecking the economy. But here is what is most concerning to me. My Republican colleagues cheered on Trump with every lie he told. It is clear Republicans in Congress will not stand up to the president's actions that are raising costs and making our country less safe. And it is time to flip the balance of power in Washington.
Members are directed to uphold and maintain decorum in the House and to cease any further disruptions. That's your warning.
Representative Al Green was escorted out of the chamber after loudly protesting the president's comments, while other Democrats held up signs reading liar and king.
Getting some of those files, she's going to be reading a story from Monica Ruiz, the executive director of Casa Central.
I'm not at the State of the Union speech tonight because these are not normal times, and Democrats have to stop behaving normally. And I'm not at the State of the Union speech tonight because you're not going to hear about the State of the Union. You are going to hear lie after lie. You are going to hear attack after attack. You are going to see grandstanding.
During the address itself, at least a dozen members from both chambers publicly announced they would boycott the State of the Union entirely and join a People's State of the Union protest rally outside the Capitol instead.
Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski calls the investigation an attempt at coercion, warning if the Federal Reserve loses its independence, the stability of our markets and the broader economy will suffer. Does the president believe that the Fed should operate independently from him?
The president has made it quite clear he thinks Jerome Powell is bad at his job.
But does he believe in the independence of the Fed, Caroline?
He has, and he said that many times.
Senator Lisa Murkowski, another Republican, called the Powell probe clearly coercion and said Congress should investigate the Department of Justice. A president speaking to a half-empty chamber, senators walking out, members getting escorted out, Republican senators blocking nominations and calling for investigations of the DOJ. This is what it looks like when the partisan protection wall around a president's most extreme institutional overreach develops the most consequential cracks. Stay with me, because I am going to break down exactly what happened, exactly why Republican defections matter more than Democratic protests, exactly what the Fed independence fight means, and exactly why thousands of No Kings rallies across the country suggest this rebellion is not just inside the Beltway.
And making our country less safe. And it's time to flip the balance of power in Washington. That work starts right here in Virginia. We've got to protect this Senate seat. We've got to re-elect our Democratic House delegation. And we've got an opportunity to flip as many as 4 House seats from red to blue. My campaign team and I are working right now to build the infrastructure Democrats need to compete in every corner of Virginia. But we can't do it without your support.
Warner walking out and saying he could not sit through Trump's lies is documented and real. The specific constitutional mechanism Tillis is deploying, the Senate's advice and consent authority over presidential nominations, is the most formal institutional power that individual senators can use to constrain executive branch personnel decisions. Tillis specifically described the DOJ probe as an attempt to undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve and question the DOJ's integrity. That is the most formal available Republican senatorial accountability statement about exactly the institutional capture concerns that have been building for months. A Republican senator blocking all Fed nominations over DOJ coercion of the Fed chair is the most formal institutional Republican accountability action.
We're thinking about bringing a suit against Powell for incompetence.
Tonight, Republican Senator Tom Tillis says he will block a vote on any of the president's Fed nominees until the investigation into Powell is resolved.
What's your message to the administration?
My message isn't to the administration. My message to whoever who went after what I consider to be vindictive prosecution to grow up and give the president better advice.
And his Republican affiliation makes it the most alarming signal that the partisan protection wall around the president's most extreme institutional overreach is developing consequential cracks. Murkowski's clearly coercion characterization is the most specifically alarming additional Republican voice in this story. Murkowski saying the Powell DOJ probe is clearly coercion and calling for a congressional investigation of the DOJ is the most formal available Republican senatorial accountability demand for oversight of the most extreme second-term institutional capture.
The DOJ have shifted, with critics of the president accusing him of using the department to go after his political enemies. According to Justice Connection, a network of DOJ alumni, more than 230 prosecutors and employees were fired in the past year, with thousands more estimated to have quit under President Trump.
Former prosecutors have documented that the president has succeeded in completely politicizing the DOJ and turning it into a political faction. Murkowski's clearly coercion characterization adds the most credible available Republican institutional voice to the documented Democratic and former prosecutor accountability assessment. Murkowski's clearly coercion statement, plus Tillis blocking nominations, plus former prosecutors saying the DOJ is completely politicized, equals the most comprehensively documented bipartisan accountability assessment of extreme DOJ institutional capture. And its bipartisan character is the most important feature for eliminating the partisan framing escape hatch. Now, let me talk about the tightrope walking Republicans, because this is the most revealing signal about what is happening behind closed doors. Other Republicans are documented as walking a tightrope, publicly defending the president against accusations of overreach, while quietly warning that using the DOJ to target political enemies crosses a line. That specific documented pattern of public defense combined with private warning is the most precisely alarming signal about the Republican institutional calculation. It establishes that the private Republican assessment of extreme DOJ institutional overreach is more alarming than the public defense posture suggests. Republicans who publicly defend the president while quietly warning he has crossed a line are making a private accountability assessment they are not yet willing to make publicly. And the specific character of those private warnings, focused on the DOJ targeting of political enemies, most directly connects the tightrope Republican private assessment to the documented institutional accountability concerns that Tillis and Murkowski have most specifically and most publicly expressed. Tightrope Republicans privately warning while publicly defending is the most specifically alarming signal about the realistic state of the Republican accountability calculation, and its character as documented in credible reporting makes it the most formal evidence that the Tillis and Murkowski public defections most likely represent a larger private Republican concern that is not yet fully translated into public accountability action. Now let me take you deeper into three specific dimensions of this story that each deserve careful attention. The first dimension is the institutional significance of the visible congressional rebellion. What does the combination of walkouts, boycotts, protest signs, and nomination blocks mean for the presidential-congressional relationship? The State of the Union address is the most constitutionally grounded expression of the presidential-congressional relationship. Article 2, Section 3 specifically requires the president to, from time to time, give to the Congress information of the State of the Union. The traditional character of the State of the Union as a moment of maximum visible bipartisan congressional deference to presidential authority makes any visible departure from that deference the most dramatically available institutional signal of congressional rebellion. A president speaking to a half-empty chamber while senators walk out and members hold up liar and king signs is making the most public and most visually immediate statement about the collapse of traditional congressional deference. The half-empty chamber during the State of the Union is the most dramatically available visual expression of presidential-congressional relationship collapse in its specific character as happening in the most traditionally deferential institutional moment. The nomination blocking power is the second institutional dimension. The Senate's advice and consent authority over presidential nominations is the most formal constitutional mechanism through which individual senators can constrain executive branch personnel decisions without requiring a Senate majority vote. A single senator can place a hold on a nomination, delaying its consideration. A group of senators can coordinate holds to comprehensively block an entire category of nominations from advancing. Tillis's specific vow to block all Federal Reserve nominations is the most dramatic deployment of that mechanism because it targets the most consequential category of nominations in federal economic governance. Blocking all Fed nominations is the most formal institutional Senate power constraint on executive economic governance function, and its deployment by a Republican senator over DOJ coercion of the Fed chair is the most specifically alarming bipartisan institutional accountability action. The second dimension is the Fed independence and DOJ coercion dimension. What does the criminal probe into the Fed chair, combined with the Tillis nomination block and the Murkowski clearly coercion characterization, mean for institutional independence? The Federal Reserve's independence from executive direction is the most specifically available institutional protection for monetary policy credibility in financial system governance. A DOJ criminal probe into the Fed chair, launched in the context of documented presidential pressure on Powell to lower interest rates, is the most specifically alarming real-world expression of executive branch coercion of an independent federal economic institution. Murkowski characterizing that probe as clearly coercion is the most formal available Republican senatorial assessment of what the documented probe most specifically represents. Tillis connecting his nomination block specifically to the attempt to undermine the independence of the Federal Reserve is the most formal available Republican senatorial accountability response to extreme executive coercion of an independent federal economic institution. DOJ probe into the Fed chair, plus Murkowski's clearly coercion statement, plus Tillis's nomination block, equals the most comprehensively documented Republican institutional accountability response to extreme executive coercion of federal economic governance independence. And its bipartisan character is the most important signal for Senate majority calculations. The third dimension is the No Kings protest convergence. What does the connection between street-level nationwide rallies and congressional walkouts and boycotts mean for accountability momentum? The People's State of the Union counter-programming, coordinated by Move On and Meet Us, there with lawmakers and citizens affected by the president's policies, most directly establishes the connection between institutional congressional walkout accountability and grassroots public accountability mobilization. A counter-programming event outside the Capitol where lawmakers join everyday citizens to provide an alternative accounting of the State of the Union is the most dramatic expression of convergence between institutional and grassroots accountability. Thousands of No Kings rallies organized around the president's attempts to rule by decree are happening across the country, outside big cities, in the most specifically alarming geographic signal. The accountability mobilization is not concentrated in coastal liberal strongholds. It is dispersed across the most broadly available geographic range, including non-traditionally progressive communities. The specific framing of the No Kings rallies as organized around the president's attempts to rule by decree most directly connects street-level grassroots accountability to the formal institutional accountability concerns that Senate walkouts and congressional boycotts most specifically expressed. Thousands of No Kings rallies across the country, plus congressional walkouts, plus Senate nomination blocks, plus DOJ investigation demands, equals the most comprehensively available multidimensional accountability mobilization of the entire second term. The documented combination of Warner walking out, Green being escorted out, Liar and King protest signs during the address, and the dozen-plus boycotters joining the People's State of the Union counter-programming together most specifically establishes the most visually dramatic and most publicly broadcast collapse of traditional presidential congressional deference. The half-empty chamber during the State of the Union is the most immediately alarming visual signal of presidential-congressional relationship breakdown. Tillis vowing to block all Federal Reserve nominations, combined with Murkowski characterizing the DOJ Powell probe as clearly coercion together, most precisely establishes the most formally documented and most credibly sourced bipartisan Republican accountability response to extreme executive coercion of federal economic governance independence. These two specific Republican defections are the most consequentially alarming signal that the partisan protection wall is developing institutional cracks. The convergence of thousands of nationwide No Kings rallies, organized around the president's attempts to rule by decree with congressional walkouts, boycotts, and Senate nomination blocks together, most precisely establishes the most comprehensively available multidimensional accountability mobilization. This combines formal institutional congressional accountability with grassroots public accountability in the most geographically dispersed and organizationally coordinated resistance format. The geographic breadth beyond coastal liberal strongholds is the most specifically alarming signal that accountability mobilization is dispersing across the broad public in ways that threaten the myth of an unassailable popular mandate. Here is exactly what you need to watch as this story continues to develop. Watch the Tillis nomination block for any expansion to additional Republican senators holding Fed or DOJ nominations, translating individual defection into comprehensive bipartisan Senate majority constraint. Watch the Murkowski investigation demand for any formal congressional oversight action targeting the DOJ Powell probe, translating the clearly coercion characterization into formal institutional accountability proceedings. Watch the tightrope Republican private warning pattern for any signals that private concern about DOJ targeting of political enemies is approaching the public accountability threshold. And watch the No Kings rally geographic breadth for any signals that nationwide dispersal is producing electoral pressure in competitive Republican-held districts. Let me leave you with the absolute bottom line. Senator Warner walked out of the president's congressional address saying he could not sit through hours of lies. Representative Green was escorted out for protesting. Members held up liar and king signs during the address. At least a dozen members boycotted the State of the Union and joined the People's State of the Union counter-programming. Republican Senator Tillis vowed to block all Federal Reserve nominations after the DOJ launched a criminal probe into Fed Chair Powell, calling it an attempt to undermine Fed independence. Republican Senator Murkowski called the Powell probe clearly coercion and demanded a congressional investigation of the DOJ. Other Republicans are documented as walking a tightrope, publicly defending while privately warning that using the DOJ to target political enemies crosses a line. Thousands of No Kings rallies organized around the president's attempts to rule by decree are dispersing across the country beyond traditional progressive strongholds. And the convergence of institutional congressional rebellion with coordinated grassroots nationwide protest is the most comprehensively available multidimensional accountability mobilization of the entire second term. The walkouts are documented. The boycotts are real. The Tillis nomination block is formally announced. The Murkowski clearly coercion characterization is on the public record. The tightrope Republicans are documented in credible reporting. And the story of presidential power crumbling after a furious Senate walkout that stunned the Capitol is the most specifically alarming and most comprehensively documented real-world expression of what it means for traditional expressions of presidential congressional deference to collapse simultaneously across formal institutional and broad grassroots accountability dimensions. We are going to be right here, watching every single development as this story continues to unfold. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Does the documented congressional rebellion, including Tillis nomination blocks, Murkowski investigation demands, and tightrope Republican private warnings, escalate toward comprehensive bipartisan Senate majority constraint on extreme institutional overreach, or do partisan protection mechanisms and loyalty enforcement contain Republican defection below the threshold where consequential institutional constraint materializes? I want to hear from you. I will see you in the next one.